Continuing now with The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And when we ended the last session, we were in chapter 20, the House Judiciary Committee hearing, and we had just finished with the testimony by a presentation, really, by James St. Clair, the president's lawyer, in his defense. So now we turn to testimony by John Doerr, presentation by John Doerr, who I just showed you a picture of him in the last session. He's the counsel to the House Judiciary Committee. The next day, it was Doerr's turn. For months, he had meticulously avoided any suggestion of advocacy. Now the monotone was gone, and he spoke with a passion that reflected his frustration, anger, and deeply held conviction. St. Clair, he said, had things upside down. When you get to the proof, you find yourself in the labyrinth of the White House, in the Byzantine Empire where yes meant no, and go was stop, and maybe meant certainly, and it is confusing, perplexing, and puzzling, and difficult for any group of people to sort out. But that is just the very nature of the crime, that in executing the means, everything will be done to confuse and to fool, to misconstrue so that the purpose of the decision is concealed. My judgment is that the facts are overwhelming in this case, that the President of the United States authorized a broad, general plan of illegal electronic surveillance, and that plan was put into operation by his subordinates. Following that, I say the President made the decision to cover up this. The President made the decision to cover up this shortly after the break-in on June 17th, and he's been in charge of the cover-up from that day forward. What he decided should be done following the Watergate break-in caused action not only by his own servants, but by the agencies of the United States, including the Department of Justice, the FBI, the CIA, and the Secret Service. It required perjury, destruction of evidence, obstruction of justice, all crimes. But most important, it required deliberate, contrived, continued, and continuing deception of the American people. St. Clair, who had not been present for Doerr's summary, picked up a copy of the afternoon Washington Star-News at a newsstand outside the White House. The headline, "Doerr Calls for Impeachment," surprised him. He had thought Doerr would not go so hard, but he realized someone had to answer his argument of the day before. In all, he empathized with Doerr. It was unfair to force Doerr to stay neutral to the very end and then to have him cram all his advocacy into one afternoon. That, he decided, must account for Doerr's basic mistake. The story said that Doerr had told the committee that the President had directed the cover-up. An extreme position, an unsupportable statement, a strategic error, St. Clair thought. It was another sign that the President would win, if not in the committee, then in the end. At the President's seaside villa in California, Ziegler issued a blast in response to Doerr's presentation. He called Doerr partisan, radical, and biased. Ziegler said Doerr apparently thought he was working for a kangaroo court. St. Clair arrived at the presidential compound in San Clemente at 9 a.m. on Monday, July 22nd, 3 days after Doerr's presentation. He intended only to brief the president and maybe get in some golf. But Ziegler had scheduled a televised press conference for him to rebut Doerr's charges against the president. St. Clair met with Nixon and Haig for nearly 2 hours and spent the rest of the day preparing. The reporters were far more interested in St. Clair's thoughts on the forthcoming decision of the Supreme Court, however, than on the past week's judiciary proceedings. They wanted to know if Nixon would obey an order to turn over the tapes. St. Clair, trying to hide his own concern, ducked the question as best he could. The fact was that he didn't know what Nixon would do if the ruling was adverse. The president had ordered that no one on the staff say whether there would be compliance. A promise to comply would tempt the court to rule against him, Nixon had said. If the justices thought he was prepared to defy them, they might be less inclined to rule against him. Defiance would undermine the very basis of the court's authority and create a constitutional crisis, and Nixon wanted to convey that threat. St. Clair had bowed to the president's strategy. He realized how bad he looked. It was inappropriate, he kept insisting to the reporters, for him to comment on a pending court case. The president had invited Robert Finch, his old friend and former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, to visit him that day at San Clemente. Finch thought that Nixon looked very tired. The president seemed fatalistic about his prospects. There was no hint of what he might do to avoid impeachment. The country had become so consumed by Watergate, Nixon said, that foreign affairs and the economy were being neglected. He could not just abdicate his position of leadership, resign, in the face of the unstable world situation. Finch was struck by the force of the president's words, the conviction behind them. He had arrived thinking that perhaps Nixon wanted to ask him to come back to Washington and help with the defense. But that was not the purpose of the invitation, though Finch was not sure what the purpose was, even after they had spent 45 minutes together. The president rambled. The governments under tight martial law in the Far East, he said, were much better prepared to take hard measures to remedy their economies than were the Western European governments, which existed on thin parliamentary majorities. He reviewed the global picture, the oil problem, the Middle East, the Far East, the power of China, the economy of Japan, relations between the Chinese and the Japanese, between the Russians and the Chinese. Watergate was making it difficult for the United States to compete internationally, he said. Abruptly, the president changed subjects and expressed his regret that Finch had not run for the Senate or for the governorship of California. It was an awkward moment. Finch had abandoned his campaign plans when it became obvious that his long association with Nixon made it impossible to win at the polls. The economy, Finch lied to the president now, had made it too difficult for him to run this year. But Nixon seemed to know better. He spoke of the loyalty of his old friends and how tough it was for him to see them suffer because of Watergate. On his way out, Finch encountered Ollie Atkins, the official White House photographer, and said he was puzzled about the purpose of the meeting. Atkins told him that the president had wanted someone there to whom he could reach out and touch, nothing more. In Washington, a bipartisan majority on the Judiciary Committee was at last taking shape. The key to consensus still lay with the undecideds, 3 Southern Democrats and the small group of Republican swing votes. Rodino had spoken with Alabama Democrat Walter D. Flowers several times over the last few weeks, each time prodding him to get the undecideds together and hammer out some agreement. But no meeting had taken place. They were all in casual contact, occasionally reviewing each other's position on the evidence, but they had yet to sit down as a single group. Time was running out. The committee's final televised deliberations were to begin in 2 days, and there still was no agreement on acceptable articles of impeachment. At the lunch break on Monday, Rodino went to see Flowers again. Over the weekend, Flowers had finally decided for sure that he would vote to impeach. "I'll check with Tom Railsback and try to set up a meeting," he told Rodino. Railsback had just returned from a weekend in Illinois where he had again reviewed the evidence, the lawyer's summaries, his notes. In the 3 weeks since he had told Joseph Alsop that he would not vote to impeach, he had been moving steadily away from the president. It was hard to escape the conclusion that directly or through Haldeman, Richard Nixon had given the orders. Railsback was angry at the committee's minority leadership. Hutchinson, the ranking Republican, regarded members of the party as duty-bound to save a Republican president. The position was offensive. Railsback remembered back to the early spring when he had received a call from William Hewitt, chairman of Deere & Company, the giant farm equipment manufacturer headquartered in his home district. Hewitt had said that Peter M. Flanagan of the White House had called him twice and wanted him to talk to Railsback about his posture on the House Judiciary Committee. Railsback resented that Richard Nixon ran the White House that way. The impeachment evidence viewed in that light seemed that much clearer. Railsback had decided he wanted to take a stand against it all. The dissembling, the stonewalling, the concealing, the lying, the cheating. Besides, he rationalized, the vote wouldn't put Nixon in jail. It was just a vote about whether he should remain in office. He told Flowers that afternoon that he would sound out Cohen, Fish, and Butler. Flowers would contact James R. Mann and Ray Thornton, his fellow Southern Democrats. At 8 o'clock the next morning, Tuesday, July 23rd, the 7 congressmen gathered in Railsback's office over coffee and Danish pastry. There was agreement that the articles of impeachment drafted by John Doerr were unacceptable, and that they should try drafting a compromise set to submit to the committee as a whole. The meeting went on for an hour without anyone actually saying he would vote for impeachment. Finally, Flowers sought some commitment. "Knowing what we know now," he asked the others, "does it justify the extreme action of removal from office?" Everyone seemed to nod assent. They were all going to vote to impeach. Flowers joked with Butler. Caldwell, do you realize that every pickup truck in Roanoke is going to be up here after you by nightfall? Thus ends chapter 20 and part 1 of The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And now we're going to move right on into part 2. So part 1 has covered the first 280 pages of the book. We've still got over 200 pages to go, and we begin part 2. And this is interesting. We are coming down to the final days, and it appears now that, yes. So we've gone through 20 chapters now. They were just simply named chapter 1, chapter 2, so forth up to chapter 20. But now we're coming down to the last few weeks, last couple of weeks of Nixon's presidency. And the chapters after this are titled by day. So we're going to go day by day. So each chapter is going to cover that particular day, one day. So we begin part 2 with Wednesday, July 24th. Jaworski and Lacavara sat quietly in a government sedan in the Washington traffic. They were confident that the Supreme Court had decided in their favor. The real gamble had been in May, when they had asked the High Court to bypass the Court of Appeals. The only question now was whether they had all 8 justices who were voting. NBC reporter Carl Stern had called an hour earlier with a tip that the court was unanimous, but Jaworski, cautious by nature, was waiting to hear it directly from the justices. Turning south down First Street, they passed the Senate caucus room, where a year and a day before, Senator Sam Ervin had read to the gallery and a national television audience a letter from the president about the tapes. Before their existence became publicly known, Nixon had written, I personally listened to a number of them. The tapes are entirely consistent with what I know to be the truth and what I have stated to be the truth. End quote. Across the street from the Supreme Court building, 2 men wearing Nixon and Kissinger masks held a large banner that quoted Nixon's remark to Mitchell from the March 22nd tape. I don't give a shit what happens. I want you all to stonewall it. Let them plead the Fifth Amendment, cover up, or anything else that will save the plan. That's the whole point. Jaworski and Lacavara, having pushed their way through a crowd of reporters, photographers, and cheering spectators, entered the courtroom shortly before 11 a.m. White House Assistant Counsel Jerry Murphy was sitting at the counsel table to the left. They took their places at the table on the right, reserved for the government. Sometime earlier, they had agreed they would, probably get a 5-3 decision, and that William O. Douglas, the most liberal of the justices, would be likely to draft the majority opinion. Lacavara was recalculating when the court-martial interrupted. The Honorable, the Chief Justice, and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. The packed room was quiet as the black-robed justices filed in. Lacavara fingered the thread hanging from the lucky suit he had worn in all his appearances before the court. Chief Justice Warren Burger took his seat in the center of the elevated bench and slowly and deliberately began to read. Jaworski and Lacavara knew instantly that the decision must be unanimous. The Chief Justice was delivering it. Only the justices and their clerks knew how total the agreement was. On July 9th, just a day after the oral arguments, the justices had unanimously decided against the president. Burger had assigned himself to draft the opinion. He shared some of the president's sentiments about executive privilege and wanted to establish a constitutional standard for the doctrine. The other justices, however, found his opinion inadequate and suggested major revisions. Burger worked hard to stitch the suggestions into a consistent whole, but he still did not produce a satisfactory opinion. Some of the clerks remarked privately that Earl Warren would have had an opinion within 3 hours of the first conference, Earl Warren, the previous Chief Justice. Finally, Justice Potter Stewart undertook to co-author the opinion. Gradually, the other justices returned the working drafts with fewer changes. The day before the decision was to be announced, the justices accepted a final version which acknowledged a constitutional basis for executive privilege, but rejected the president's particular claim as generalized and undifferentiated. In careful but clear language, the court ordered the president to turn over the tapes of 64 subpoenaed conversations to Judge Sirica. Murphy heard Berger conclude, "Accordingly, the judgment under review is affirmed." Standing as the justice filed out, he was thinking about how to get to the nearest phone. At the White House, Bizarre's assistant, Richard Hauser, dashed to his boss's office, muttering, "8-zip." "What does zip mean?" Jane Thomas, Bizarre's secretary, asked as Hauser swept by. Bizarre was not surprised. He and Haig had long been reconciled to an adverse decision. As soon as the court bypassed the appeals court, they were fairly certain the president would lose. When Bizarre had heard that the Chief Justice was drafting the majority opinion, he called Haig in San Clemente to tell him that the decision not only would be adverse, but would possibly be unanimous. That would make things difficult. If there was no minority opinion, there was little room to maneuver for partial compliance, and the president would have lost the support of his own appointees, men who supposedly shared his judicial philosophy. Haig had heard the warning, but hadn't wanted to talk strategy. He would wait and see. Now Bizarre was calling to say they couldn't wait any longer. He required instructions. How were they going to react? First, Haig said he would have to inform the president. He would check and get back soon. Haig's aide, Charles Wardell, brought him the wire service copy, and the general took it over to the residence. It was early in San Clemente, only a little past 8:30. The president was not yet in his office. When Haig called back, Bizarre was finishing another cup of the black coffee that he drank almost addictively. Now he would get his instructions. But the president himself came on the line. Bizarre was surprised. He hadn't talked to the president for a long time. "There might be a problem with the June 23rd tape, Fred," Nixon said. Bizarre thought the president must be referring to some national security matter. "Get right on it and get back to Al," Nixon instructed. Ziegler watched the televised announcement of the Supreme Court decision from his suite at the Surf and Sand overlooking the Pacific. As the morning breakers crashed 100 yards below his window, he scratched some notes on a yellow legal pad. He knew he would be spending the morning with the president, fashioning some response. Nixon would drown him with requests for more and more information, for alternatives. He rode a borrowed Honda to the Nixon compound, arriving just after 9 a.m. Despite a California tan, Ziegler looked white and tired to Connie Girard, his secretary. Accustomed to his imperious manner, Girard carried a suit coat, shirt, tie, and dress shoes into his office. She shared with the other secretaries the chore of transporting her boss's dry cleaning and dirty laundry and shopping for his clothes. Sometimes she selected several pairs of new shoes, waited as he tried them on, advised him on the color and style, and then took back the rejects to the store. Ziegler had recently lost 30 pounds. That meant he had needed a lot of new clothes. His staff accepted these menial chores with varying degrees of tolerance, recognizing that the demands he made on them were extensions of the pressure the president put on him. His temper tantrums were excused on similar grounds. Nixon raged at Ziegler, they knew, and Ziegler raged back at whoever was handy. And in a footnote, they add, the press office staff was less tolerant of Ziegler's insistence that his coffee be served in a cup and saucer identical to the president's, cream-colored Lenox china with a silver presidential seal, and that his scotch be poured only into a cocktail glass embossed with the presidential emblem. Combining resentment and jest at the way Ziegler treated them, his staff took to adding the Filipino suffix "chan" to their names. The president and his family were served by Filipino stewards. Thus, the regular duties of Ann Chan Greer included pickup and delivery of Ziegler's laundry at the Golden Star Valet, 4 blocks from the White House. Karen Chan Nordstrom was assigned to scout Ziegler's littered hotel rooms for underwear and other items he left behind at checkout time. Judy Chan Johnson set up his desk each morning with a pack of Marlboros, a matchbook embossed with the presidential seal, a roll of certs, and a day's supply of Titrolac. Connie Chan Girard spent hours on the phone trying to arrange tennis matches with partners of sufficient White House rank not to offend Ziegler's sense of protocol, but with skill enough to challenge his own court abilities. Summer intern Tim Chan Smith took Ziegler's shoes to the Carlton barbershop for their regular shine. Girard gave him the morning newspapers, already marked in yellow to spot important material, and waited to be sure he hadn't lost the motorcycle key again. Ziegler didn't even glance at the papers. He shouted for his coffee, made a couple of notes on a legal pad, and charged out the door, heading for Building A. Haig's secretary, Muriel Hartley, was in no mood to see Ziegler now or ever. As he stormed by her toward Haig's office, she tried unsuccessfully to stop him. "The SOB muscles his way in on everything," she had once complained. "Even Dr. Kissinger asks first." She had suggested to Haig that he put a lock on his door which could be released from a buzzer on her desk. Haig had said no. She knew, though, that Haig often didn't want Ziegler in there. Perhaps today might be different. The general had gone to the residence 45 minutes earlier to brief the president and had just come back, his mouth set in a tight line. He was in his office with St. Clair and Joanne, and they all looked very grim. The door between Haig's office and the president's was closed as Ziegler joined them, and though the president hadn't yet arrived. Nixon had exploded when Haig told him of the court's unanimous decision. How could the men he had appointed, Berger, Blackman, and Powell, not follow their conscience, fail to support him? For Nixon, the question of compliance was still an open matter. He was not prepared to make a snap decision. He wanted to weigh the alternatives carefully. Maybe he'd finally follow through on his often repeated threat. He would burn the tapes and resign. As Ziegler listened to Haig, he knew what he was in for. The president needed to let off steam, and the assignment of taking the heat was going to fall to him. Haig took his share, but he readily deferred to Ziegler whenever possible. Often Ziegler would sit for hours alternately listening to the president's intemperate and garbled tirades, and then to endless questions and requests for information. At times it was almost overwhelming. The president had always despised small talk, but lately he would interrupt the conversation and ramble, usually about his past triumphs. Then suddenly he would seem to be jolted to the president and would offer preposterous alternatives, make ridiculous suggestions. Ziegler accepted these remarks as offhand challenges. They were not to be taken literally, and he did not take them so. Like Haig, Ziegler had learned to simply ignore Nixon's more outrageous orders. Haldeman had once said that it was a staff officer's duty to ignore any clearly inappropriate demand, even if the president had insisted on it. Ziegler's rapid rise, after Haldeman and Ehrlichman had departed, at first found him poorly equipped to accomplish such sidesteps, and he had passed along some of the president's more ill-considered notions. Gradually, he had learned to deflect most of them, however. As he became more confident, he said that he had never realized what yes-men Haldeman and Ehrlichman had been. Often the president only needed time, sometimes just a few minutes, to cool off. The president seemed to trust Ziegler more each day and found relief in sitting and rummaging through his thoughts with him. Ziegler was impressed by his complexity and sensitivity. If only the world knew the real Richard Nixon, he often remarked, the public would appreciate him so much more. Over the last year, Ziegler had become a counselor to the president in the most fundamental sense, his confidant and alter ego. Each tiny move the president made was run through Ziegler again and again. Ziegler watched the painful deterioration of the president's popularity and political strength, and with it, the deterioration of his spirit. Still, at times, Nixon could be extraordinarily thorough and alert. He hungered after facts, information, approaches, alternatives. The president's demands on him took all of Ziegler's days. He had no time but to sit and listen, go out and try to implement, and before he was halfway through his tasks, answer a call from the president to come back and listen some more. He had learned to dodge some of the calls. He instructed his secretaries to develop alibis for him. Ziegler had begun to see himself in the crucible through which the president's decisions were forged. Ziegler had begun to see himself as the crucible through which the president's decisions were forged. He had become sophisticated in anticipating demands. He would have Sawyer and Gannon prepare lists of positive suggestions on every conceivable aspect of the situation. Then, at the appropriate moment, he would slip them into the conversation as if they had been the president's ideas. He watched Nixon's decision-making curve move up and down and waited for the right moments to press his points. He offered his advice cautiously, fearful that it might be interpreted as too bold or too harsh. A number of aides had fallen into disfavor for offering painful advice. The details of running the country had been left to General Haig as the president withdrew more and more into himself to reflect on his Watergate options. Nixon had lost interest in domestic affairs, and he gave only occasional bursts of attention to foreign policy. Haig might remind the chief that it was time to make a decision, but it fell to Ziegler to sit and listen to the convolutions of the president's laborious debates with himself. Today, a decision would have to be made. And I'm going to stop there. Again, we're in part 2 now of The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And the current chapter is Wednesday, July 24th, 1974. So we'll stop there and continue at that point in the next session. Thank you for watching.